Now, the FBI probe into Paul Manafort continues as details of one of his business deals has actually come to light through the investigation. Now, the Daily Beast had reported that Manafort had once partnered on an $850 million New York real estate deal with an ally, Vladimir Putin, and a Ukrainian moneyman whom the Justice Department recently described as, quote, an organized crime member. So this is the Justice Department saying, hey man, this guy's he was a member of the mob, essentially the Russian mob or the Ukrainian mob. So, well, that's very interesting. Now, that's according to a 2008 memo written by Rick Gates. Now, Rick Gates used to be Paul Manafort's business partner, and they actually went in together on his $850 million real estate deal. Now, why is that important? Well, according to two former federal prosecutors, the hotel deal is likely to be an item of focus for Special Counsel Robert Mueller's inquiry into ties between Trump associates and the government of Russia. So now, look, I gotta point this out because I think a lot of people get the wrong idea when I talk about Russia. I'm not talking about the Russian people. The Russian people did nothing wrong. It's the Russian government, which is corrupt as hell, and the Russian billionaires. So what we're thinking, what the theory is here, is that Russian business interests might have some undue influence over Paul Manafort and different members of the Trump cabinet, and maybe using that influence to get business deals, to get preferential treatment from the U.S. government. That's a bit of a problem. So Robert Mueller, he's looking into this, and he found this, he's examining this deal specifically for a New York real estate deal that's worth $850 million. That's a lot of money, okay? Now, some White House officials have noticed that they were looking into this deal, and they're getting a little nervous. Now, that's curious. Why would they get nervous about this? Well, let me give you the details. Now, they spoke to the Daily Beast on a condition of anonymity, right? Now, they feel that Manafort may have made President Trump more legally vulnerable through his decades of business deals, similar to this one, with foreign governments and Eastern European power brokers. Those deals, these White House aides suspect, led federal investigators down a money trail, gotta follow the money, that threatens to plunge the Trump White House into further legal jeopardy. Very interesting. Asked whether any Manafort deals seem particularly troubling in retrospect, a senior administration official replied, "You mean like this one?" and appended a link to a 2016 story on Manafort's alleged attempts to launder a Ukrainian oil and gas billionaire's fortune through New York real estate. Now, that includes that $850 million deal on the Drake Hotel. So let me tell you about the Drake deal in a minute. Now, again, it turns out that, and I never realized this before, and I'm an idiot for not realizing it, but it turns out that real estate is actually a very simple way to launder large amounts of money. And organized crime has apparently used the real estate market in order to do that. Again, I had no idea. Maybe it's because I'm not into organized crime. I don't know. But again, that's something that was new to me, but seems to happen. So, and I think it's because it's an unregulated market, and there's such large sums of money that go through this when it comes to real estate deals. So, now anyway, one of the billionaires that Paul Manafort had tried to do this Drake deal with is now being sought by the Justice Department for extradition in relation to money laundering charges. So that's very interesting. Let me give you the details on that. Now, the person in question is named Dmitry Firtash, and back in 2013, he was indicted in a Chicago federal court for racketeering charges. That's very interesting. Daily Beast explains, 2 weeks ago, in response to a legal filing from Firtash seeking dismissal of this case, the acting U.S. Attorney General in Chicago termed Firtash and a deputy as, quote, 2 organized crime members. Very interesting. And people identified by the United States law enforcement as 2 upper echelon associates of Russian organized crime. Again, very interesting. Now, years before the indictment, they write, Firtash was a major money man for the Party of Regions in Ukraine. Now, that party happened to be more pro-Russia. Now, interestingly enough, and how this ties into Manafort, is that Manafort had consulted for that political party. Very interesting. Now, Firtash's alliance with Manafort to acquire the Drake has been reported before, but far less attention has gone to the involvement of another person involved in that same deal. Now, this is a guy that I've talked about before, and he's another magnate named Oleg Deripaska, and he is one of the wealthiest men in Russia, and happens to be a good friend of Vladimir Putin. So there's your government association. Now, in 2006, according to the AP, Deripaska signed a $10 million annual contract with Manafort for what Manafort pitched as political and economic efforts inside the United States to greatly benefit the government of Vladimir Putin. Very interesting. Now, again, I talked about Deripaska. I talked about that deal. I've talked about the fact that Manafort was essentially a lobbyist for a foreign government and foreign billionaire. Now, look, there's nothing illegal about that as long as you disclose that you were working with a foreign government. Now, if you're working for a foreign government, lobbying on their behalf, but you do not disclose it, well, that's where you can run into some legal trouble. But here we have 2 billionaires, one connected with oil and gas, and the other under indictment for organized crime, that are all connected with Paul Manafort, whose job it was, at some point, working for these 2 different people and working with them to do, number one, a real estate deal, which could be used to launder money, and also he had been lobbying on behalf of one of these 2 gentlemen. Interesting. Okay. Look, it's no wonder that Mueller is looking at this and going, there could be something there. Very interesting. Now, again, real estate, money laundering, Russian oligarchs, connected to organized crime, or allegedly connected to organized crime. Okay. Now, speaking of real estate deals, right? Now, do you know anybody who's currently in a very high position of power that happens to have also been into real estate? Well, his name's everywhere, and he's currently the president of the United States. Now, that's not evidence of anything, but some of these real estate deals that may be connected to money laundering could end up being tied back to Donald Trump. It is a possibility. But back to Manafort here for a second. Now, Manafort wasn't just a political operative for Deripaska. He was also a business partner. Now, according to back to Gates here in that memo in 2008, said when Paul met with Mr. D, again, we don't know who Mr. D is. We think it's Mr. Deripaska, but I'll get in that in a minute. When Paul met with Mr. D last month, he told Paul to lock in the other financing elements and then come back to him for the final piece of investment. Now, Gates was writing to 2 business associates of Deripaska. That's Anton Wisniewski and Andrei Zagorsky. Now, according to ex-prosecutors, the business relationship between a Kremlin-tied oligarch and an accused gangster and the manager of Donald Trump's campaign is the sort of arrangement currently occupying Mueller's time. According to Barbara McQuaid, U.S. Attorney General, that was a former U.S. Attorney General for Detroit until Donald Trump just happened to have fired her back in March, she said any financial dealings with Russia and Ukraine would be considered within the scope of Mueller's current mandate. With the search warrant executed on Manafort's home, looking for bank records, tax records, and the like, it seems like this is the kind of thing that Mueller would be interested in. Now, like I said, this investigation, this isn't about Russian hacking. Okay, this isn't about Russia coming in and allegedly changing the vote totals, which they didn't do. There's no evidence of. This isn't even about hacking into the DNC. which, again, there's evidence to suggest that that didn't happen, that it was actually an inside source. So, no, this is not what the investigation is about anymore. This is about financial corruption. And Mueller, what he's looking for is a deal between wealthy Russian criminal elements and Donald Trump. This doesn't have anything to do with the Russian people. It doesn't even necessarily have anything to do with the Russian government at large. Although there are certain players, like Vladimir Putin, that could be involved. Nowhere does this also call for any sort of armed conflict with Russia. I know there's a lot of people that are afraid of that. No, what this is about is trying to find out whether or not certain wealthy interests connected with the Russian government, or not even connected, just certain wealthy foreign interests, have any sort of leverage over Donald Trump. These are the oligarchs, by the way, the same ones that we're talking about, that are crushing the Russian people, that are adding to climate change because they're oil and gas magnates, that have done that are accused of being members of organized crime. These are not good people, allegedly. Okay, it's naive to think that these people wouldn't use their money and power to try to influence a foreign government if it helps their business interests. It's not like we haven't had American corporations doing the same thing, influencing foreign governments in order to get better business deals for themselves. Hell, but they didn't even have to do that. The U.S. government itself has aided our multinational corporations in order to get better deals for those corporations. We once overthrew a government over bananas. Okay? Where do you think the term banana republic comes from? So yes, our billionaires have effectively used our government in order to get better business deals for themselves. So why wouldn't other countries, other billionaires in other countries do the same thing? It's rather naive to think that that's not a possibility that could happen. Especially when some of these billionaires receive their fortunes through organized crime. Now, back to that 2008 memo. In it, Gates writes to Deripaska's associates, "We need to finalize the Pericles participation in this deal as the final component in the financing structure in the next 2 weeks to lock in the deal." And it was signed off by saying that he would be available to come to Moscow immediately to discuss and finalize the details of the transaction. Now, what is Pericles? Well, that refers to Pericles Emerging Market Partners. Now, that is actually a private equity fund Manafort and Deripaska worked together to establish in the Cayman Islands back in March of 2007. Gates also assisted in the management of this fund. Court documents from the dissolution of the Pericles partnership, filed by Deripaska's Surf Horizon Limited, claim to hold a majority, if not all, of the economic interest in the partnership. In other words, Deripaska's company invested with Manafort in Pericles, and Pericles was set to be the prime investor in the Drake Hotel. Manafort, Firtash, and Deripaska had intended to convert the Drake into a luxury office and residential space called Bulgari Tower. Gates, in his 2008 memo, estimated that the revamped 70-story Bulgari Tower would generate over $3 billion in value as a result of the unique combination of retail, smart office space, residential, and a luxury hotel. Now, so far, that's not a problem. If you set up a fund and you want to go do a hotel, an investment in New York, in like I said, in a building that does office space, hotels, that kind of thing, not a problem. Not a problem. However, that's not necessarily what they thought was going to happen. At least certain people thought it wasn't going to happen. And then for that we go to the former Prime Minister of Ukraine. Now that's weird. Now we're getting involved in the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, who had actually went to court over this because, look, the Drake Hotel ended up not actually happening. And attorneys for Manafort co-defendant told the New York federal court that the project never proceeded beyond due diligence, whatever that means. But I know that basically they're saying it didn't get built. It didn't get built. We tried to do the financing, and I'll get to that, but it never materialized. Now, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, how this guy fits into it, and again, this is getting to be a crazy story, Yulia Tymoshenko alleged in a federal lawsuit that the hotel deal was not intended to be an actual hotel or a business venture. It was actually intended to launder money. Again, very interesting. Now, what's more interesting is how they actually got a hold of these memos. Gates' memo was entered into the court record in Tymoshenko's lawsuit after it was part of batches of documents recovered from a river following the 2014 flight from power of Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Viktor Yanukovych was a former Ukrainian prime minister who was pro-Putin. Now, this guy was aided by Manafort and Firtash. Not only that, but some of these documents were also found in the sauna of Yanukovych's prosecutor general. This is some crazy shit that's going on. So did they try to drown these documents, or did they lose them somehow? Did they throw a briefcase in the river? Did they drop something? Fuck, I don't know. But if they did throw this into the river, why do that if it was a legitimate business deal? I don't understand. And this is weird, and it actually gets even more complicated. Tymoshenko, whom the Yanukovych government jailed, accused several Party of Regents figures of retaliating against her, in part for her move to eliminate Firtash's firm, as the middleman in the natural gas transactions between Ukraine and Russia. But in September 2015, New York federal judge Kimba Wood had dismissed that lawsuit against Firtash, Manafort, and several other co-defendants. Now, it's important that Deripaska, who was also part of the Drake deal, he was actually not included as a defendant in the case. In her dismissal, Wood did not dispute the authenticity of the memos, which is very, very important, or other facts of the relationships between Manafort, Firtash, and other foreign partners. However, she had simply considered them legally irrelevant to the misfortunes of Tymoshenko. Now, again, getting into the details with all these different players, and I realize that there's a lot of people involved in this, including former prime ministers of Ukraine. So, again, but Tymoshenko, her attorneys, I should say, did not know whether the Mr. D and Gates memo had referred to Firtash or Deripaska. But other documents they discovered from the Manafort team referred to Firtash and his economic interests with acronyms like DF and DF Group. Subsequently, they filed in April 2014 a memo to the court explaining Gates' recipients were associates of Oleg Deripaska, referred to in the memo only as Mr. D. So now we know who Mr. D is. Now, Kenneth McCallion, Tymoshenko's attorney and former federal prosecutor, subsequently asserted in court that the memo confirms that Paul Manafort had direct contacts with high-level Russian figures who were, upon information and belief, under investigation by the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice for alleged money laundering and other criminal activities within and without the United States, and that Manafort, Gates, and their U.S. partners were directly conspiring to defraud the parties Gates proposed to Deripaska's people to enlist in the venture. Again, the venture was the Drake Hotel deal. So based on what we know, McCallion told the Daily Beast, it appears that both Deripaska and Firtash were involved in the Drake Hotel deal. He said, I am reasonably certain now that Mr. D is Deripaska, since it is referenced in the relationship to Pericles, which was definitely Deripaska's company, not Firtash's. So, okay, so again, there's a lot of details in that, but it gets into more. So now we're going to talk about organized crime. I mentioned that at least one of these guys is connected to Russian organized crime. So let's get into that. Now, Firtash had been accused of laundering money. Again, inside this deal with Manafort and Deripaska. Now, he was actually trying to set up this deal. In fact, Firtash had wired $25 million to Paul Manafort's account as a show of seriousness about building the Drake Hotel. The insurance company that handled the account, First American Title Insurance, noted the delivery was in the form of cash funds by wire transfer and that Manafort had immediate access to the account. So that's Firtash. What about Deripaska? Now, Deripaska, he's the one who has been accused of having criminal connections. And in 2006, the State Department temporarily pulled his visa over concerns about those criminal connections. Now, the Wall Street Journal had reported in 2007 concerns now exacerbated by his prospective involvement in a deal alongside an indicted figure like Firtash. Reportedly, Deripaska is now seeking cooperation with Senate investigators. So, and I talked about that the last time I did the story about Paul Manafort and his criminal connections, that Deripaska is like, I don't want anything to do with Paul Manafort anymore. He screwed me out of what I'm saying is $19 million over this deal, over our Cayman Islands joint account. Hey, man, like, he screwed me over. I want to talk to prosecutors. Let's talk to this. Let's talk about this. Let's see if we can lessen my charges and go after Paul Manafort. So, again, this is very interesting. And look, it's because that deal and their partnership had fallen apart. Back in 2014, Deripaska had actually sued them for what he said ghosting. It appears, as Cayman Island filing says, that Paul Manafort and Rick Gates have simply disappeared. Deripaska separately claimed in 2015 that Manafort and Associates owed him $19 million, which Manafort denies. And back to Mueller here and how this appears to Robert Mueller. And this is Renato Mariotti, a former federal prosecutor in Chicago. He considers the Drake deal to be very significant to Mueller's inquiry. He said the fact that Manafort has a close business relationship with at least two of these people means that Mueller will scour Manafort's finances and the records of these transactions to determine what benefits Manafort received and whether he owed something to these individuals. He'll also look to see anything about Manafort's relationship with these individuals that could have been used as leverage by them. And that is the whole point of this entire investigation, to find whether or not any of these guys has a financial or has some sort of financial leverage over Paul Manafort and even over other associates of Donald Trump and maybe even Donald Trump himself. And that's where you're going to try to find a connection. Now, if it exists, he's going to find it by following the money. And that's what we're looking at here. That's why he asked for the tax records. That's why he asked for the business transactions. Because he knows you got to follow the money. And that money, wherever it leads, look, if you do a deal and you borrow money from oligarchs or fellow oligarchs or even the Russian mob, well, they're gonna have some leverage over you, right? And that's what we're looking at. That's what Robert Mueller is trying to determine, whether or not these people who are criminally connected have loaned money, or that Paul Manafort or any of the other, Michael Flynn owes money to any of these groups that they can use as leverage for their own business interests. And that's the problem here. Now, and of course, that's making the White House incredibly nervous, because any of those connections could also, if Trump also has a similar deal, and we find something from Manafort, and Manafort is forced to spill the beans about such a deal, if he knows, again, that's going to spell very, very bad news for Donald Trump or anyone else that's connected to these deals. So that's why it's a very, very big deal. And again, that's why people in the White House are so incredibly nervous. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.